Hello, Psychology of Learning students. Welcome to week 9. This week we'll be covering chapter 8 on punishment. It's a really fun chapter. I think you'll enjoy it a lot. Next week is your spring break, and then the following week you'll take your second exam. And your second exam will cover chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. So at the end of this week, you'll have all the new material that will be covered on the exam. So let's get started. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint slides that Dr. Stephanie Stern made that cover chapter 8. And here we go. So this is operant learning, and we're going to be focusing on punishment in this chapter. So in this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of punishment, although it was introduced in the videos having to do with chapter 5. I sort of gave an overview of punishment and reinforcement altogether. But I'm going to reintroduce it. Then I'm going to talk about the types of punishment and the variables that affect punishment. In the second video, I'll talk about the theories of punishment, some problems with punishment, and some alternatives to punishment. So let's begin by talking about Thorndike. So remember, Thorndike's the man who comes up with the law of effect. He's sort of pre-Skinner. He's the one who's got the cats, that are fooling around trying to press the lever or press another way to get out of the big box. And so Thorndike's law of effects says that behavior is a function of consequences. And remember, he's the one who talks about if a behavior leads to a satisfying state of affairs, then the behavior will be increased. So that's sort of what becomes reinforcement. But then he says some behaviors, those that result in an annoying state of affairs, those behaviors will be less likely to be repeated. They'll be weakened. So satisfying states of affairs will strengthen behaviors. Annoying states of affairs will weaken behaviors. Now, he thought that these positive and negative consequences were parallel. In other words, if you had an equally satisfying state of affairs as an annoying state was satisfying, so equal in intensity, so to speak, he thought that the annoying state of affairs would lead to the behavior to be increased to the same extent that the annoying state of affairs would lead to a decrease in behavior. In other words, both if we're going to use Skinner's terms, both reinforcers and punishers were equally effective. So as good as a reinforcer would increase behavior is as much as a punisher would decrease behavior, assuming that everything else was the same between those two things. Well, was he right? So he goes on and does an experiment where he gave students Spanish or English words, and they were asked to pick synonyms of the Spanish and English words. And to half of the participants in the study, he only tells them when they got it right. So if the student picks the right answer, he goes right, and then they go on to the next one. If a student is wrong, he says nothing. So right, that's correct. Yep, correct, correct, nothing, correct, nothing, correct, correct, nothing, 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 correct, based on whether the student's correct or not, right? In other words, he's using reinforcement. He's telling them, right on, you're doing it right, trying to increase that behavior. To the students who are in the other condition, he only tells them when they're wrong. So if they get it right, he says nothing. If they get it wrong, 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 nothing, nothing, wrong, nothing, wrong, wrong, nothing, nothing, wrong. So in other words, the students are only punished. So he thought that the students would learn equally well in both conditions. Whether you use reinforcement or punishment, they would both work equally well. But that is not what he found. He found that those that were only told that they were wrong went on to make more errors than those that were only told when they were right. In other words, reinforcement increased the behavior, the good behavior, more than punishment decreased the wrong behavior. So it looks as though reinforcement is more effective than punishment, but they're not parallel. B.F. Skinner did a similar experiment with rats, and what half of the rats, when they press the lever, they get food. In other words, they're getting reinforced. Other rats when they press the lever, a little thing would come out and would slap them. So they'd get punished for pressing the lever. So these two things were equally effective. Then the rats who were getting food should increase the pressing of the lever to the same extent that those that were getting slapped would decrease their lever pressing. And what Skinner found is that initially the slapped rats did stop pressing the lever, but it didn't last. It wasn't sustainable. So where reinforcement kept that kept that lever pressing behavior coming, the slapping did not get rid of it for very long. Got rid of it initially, but not very long. So it seems as though punishment is not as effective as reinforcement. What do you think? What do we as a class think? So what I'd like you to, the research is kind of showing punishment doesn't work as well. I want you to stop the video now and really write something down. Write down how has punishment and reinforcement worked for you throughout your life. Think about the behaviors that get reinforced and the behaviors that get punished. Which do you think worked better for you? Come up with some real concrete examples. Okay? When you're done with that, please turn the video back on. Okay, I'm glad that you guys spent some time trying to think about in your history, when has punishment worked and when has reinforcement worked? And you have some idea for you personally, is reinforcement better than punishment, like Thorndike and Skinner found with the rats and the students in his experiments? Or do you respond better to punishment? What are some of the differences between reinforcement and punishment that have worked on you? I hope you've thought about that. So remember, in conclusion, it seems as though punishment doesn't work as well as reward, and that Thorndike and Skinner underestimated the effectiveness of, they overestimated the effect of punishment. Punishment doesn't work very well. What might their experiments have produced less powerful effects in the punishment groups? So how could those experiments have been changed to make the results more parallel? You might give some thought to that. Well, let's start talking about the types of punishment. So we talked in the last couple of chapters about how there's positive reinforcement when we add something to the organism that increases the likelihood of that behavior being repeated in that situation, and negative reinforcement when we take something away from the organism that increases the likelihood of that behavior being reproduced in that same situation. Now let's talk about punishment. So with positive punishment, we're going to add something or give something to the organism that will decrease the likelihood of them giving that same behavior in that situation. With negative punishment, we're going to take something away from the organism that will decrease the likelihood of them giving that behavior again in that situation. So punishment will decrease the strength of the behavior due to the consequence. Now, just like with reinforcement, for punishment to work, you need to have these three things. The behavior must have a consequence. The behavior must decrease in strength, become less likely, and the reduction must be the result of the consequence. Remember when we talked about reinforcement, we said that the behavior must have a consequence. The behavior must increase in strength, and the increase must be because of the consequence following the behavior. So that it's a parallel thing with punishment. So again, with positive punishment, the consequence of the behavior is the appearance of or an increase in the intensity of a stimulus that we do not like very much. So it might be getting reprimanded or yelled at or an electric shock or a spanking. These are things that we're getting, usually things we don't want, aversive stimuli. We're getting something that's going to reduce the likelihood of us emitting that behavior again in that same situation. With negative punishment, something is going to be taken away. So the behavior is weakened by the removal of or a decrease in the intensity of a stimulus. Normally, it's something that we want, that we seek out. So when you give someone, when we're given fines for speeding, we're taking away money. The fine is money. When you ground your child, you're taking away their privilege of being able to go out that night. You're taking away their cell phone. You're taking away that privilege of using the cell phone. So these are all negative punishment things. Sometimes it's called penalty training. Okay. Now let's talk about some of the variables that impact punishment. And you're going to see that they're very similar to the variables that impact reinforcement. So we're going to begin by talking about contingency. So just like with reinforcement, the more contingent the punishment is on the behavior being emitted, then the quicker the organism is going to reduce their behavior based on this punishment. So when the punishment always follows the behavior and the punishment doesn't happen when they don't give the behavior, then the punishment is contingent on the behavior and you're going to get lots of really good learning. Does that make sense? Contiguity is the next one. This is the time between when the organism gives the behavior and the punishment. So the longer the delay, the less effective. So if your dog does something wrong, something you don't want them to do, maybe they start to pee on your carpet, ideally they get that punishment, you going, no, immediately, like they start to pee and you stop them right there. Ideally, there isn't a big gap. So unfortunately, in the real world, this is really hard to do. In the real world, it's really hard to make punishment happen only when the behavior occurs and every time that the behavior occurs and very close to in time to when the behavior occurs. So think about speeding. Like, what if you speed? Do you get a speeding ticket every time you speed? No, there's a lot of times where you can kind of get away with it. And when you get the speeding ticket, does it happen immediately? Well, you might get stopped and you're told you're getting the ticket, but you're actually paying for it. You're losing your money a couple weeks later. Think about a mother on a shopping trip and her child's misbehaving. In the middle of the shopping trip, she might not be able to punish the child. And so she might say, when we get to the car, I'm going to let you know what your punishment is. But because that's so removed from the behavior, it may not be as effective. When a mother says, just wait till your father gets home. Well, by the time the father gets home, that's so far away from the behavior that was done, it's probably not going to be very effective. Detentions, when you think about a teacher, a child is misbehaving and they said, you're going to have detention. Well, the child did the behavior at 10 o'clock. Detention isn't until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The continuity there is just so far apart that it's not very likely to be very effective. Okay? So ideally, the punishments happen immediately after the behavior, and they happen every time after the behavior, and the punishments only happen after the behavior. Okay. Another variable, so we've talked about contiguity and contiguity and contingency. The other thing we want to talk about here is punisher intensity. So the greater the intensity of the punishing stimulus, the greater the reduction of the punished response. And this is found out over and over and over. So think about a fine for speeding. Are you going to be less likely to speed if the fine is $25 versus $50 versus $100 versus $500? We're going to be less likely to speed with a $500 fine versus a $25 fine. So the more intense the punisher, the more likely you're going to get a reduction in the behavior. Now, this leads to an interesting concept, or at least I think it's interesting. And this has to do, if you're going to start punishing your child for something, or your spouse, or your student, whatever, you're going to start introducing a punisher. How intense should the punisher be? After all, we just said that the more intense the punisher, the better the learning will be. But do you want to start with a really intense punisher? Well, it turns out no, that it's better to start, it's like the Goldilocks effect. You don't want to start with one that's super, super strong. That won't be as effective. It might be effective for that behavior, but it's not, you're going to lose the effectiveness in other behaviors that you're trying to get rid of. But you also don't want to start out too weak. If you begin weak and then you have to keep increasing the level of the intensity to get it to work, you'll end up having to go at a much higher intensity than you would have had you started initially at the right intensity. That kind of makes sense. Not that you would ever do this as a punisher, but if you're going to, sort of like if you put your hand in water that's cold, if you start out putting your arm in water that's just lukewarm, just room temperature, and then it gets a little bit colder, and then a little bit colder, and then a little bit colder, you can keep your arm in much colder water than you would have been able to do than if it was just put in that cold water at the beginning. Same thing with punishers. So ideally, you begin with a punisher that's intense enough to suppress the behavior, but one that if the behavior does continue, you can increase it even more. So let's say you're trying to get your child to stop cursing. So the child curses and you just give them a stern look. Now, most of the time, that stern look will get the child to go, oh, yeah, that's right, and they'll stop doing it. But let's say they do it again, then you speak to them sternly. And then maybe by the 5th time, you end up having to ground them and take away some privileges. But you don't want to start with they curse once and you take away and you ground them. Well, like that's for a swear. Now what are you going to do if they steal something? Like you've started way up high. So you want to do like the Goldilocks, not too weak, not too strong, but just right. The punisher that's intense enough to get rid of the behavior, but not any more intense than that. Okay. All right. Now let's go to, oh, I love this part. Okay. How do reinforcers and punishers work together? So in the last couple of chapters, we talked about reinforcer. In this chapter, we've talked about punishment. How do they come together? So to answer that question, you really want to ask yourself, why do you do the undesirable behaviors that you do? Why do we do the undesirable things that we do? Well, it's not just that the undesirable behaviors aren't being punished. It's that there's something rewarding about the undesirable behaviors. So maybe the behavior that I want to think of that I'm doing more that I want to do is eating ice cream. Okay. So when I go to eat ice cream, it tastes so good to me. I love the coldness in my mouth. I love the taste of it going down. I love the memories that I have of eating ice cream because my mother and my grandmother and I would all eat ice cream on Saturdays after going to the mall if I was good. And we also used to eat ice cream a lot when we were on vacation at Cape Cod as a family. So for me, ice cream involves all of these memories of my mother, of special time with my mother and my grandmother, who I adored, of family times on vacation that were filled with laughing and fun and closeness, and the actual taste feeling very good. So there's so many reinforcing aspects of eating ice cream that the negative thing, the punishment for eating ice cream is that the next day or 2 days later, when I step on the scale, I weigh more than I want to weigh. But think about how the reinforcers are immediate and very contingent on my behavior of eating ice cream, where my punisher doesn't happen for a couple days later. And sometimes the scale goes up when I haven't had ice cream. It went up because I ate like a whole appetizer of fried mushrooms or something. And so you can see how reinforcement and punishment work together to have a behavior be maintained. Okay. And the effectiveness of a punishment procedure is going to depend on the frequency of the reinforcers, the amount of reinforcers, the quality of the reinforcers, and some of the other things that we've talked about. So here's an example if you think of a rat in a Skinner box. Pressing the lever for food in one of the experiments would also make the lever, it would produce a really loud, super loud sound that the rat wouldn't want. But because the rat would get food for pressing the lever, yes, it came with the loud noise, but he endured the loud noise in order to get that food. So you can see that the punishment of the loud noise only worked when the reinforcer of the food went away. So when he pressed the lever and he got food in the loud noise, he just kept pressing it. But when he pressed the lever and only got the loud noise, then he stopped pressing the lever. So you can see, especially as you're working on, as you're starting to think about your behavior modification project, if you can come up with a strategy where you're identifying the reinforcers and you're going to eliminate them. So you're taking away the food every time the rat presses the lever, and then you're going to add some punishment. You can see how those two things together is going to be your best way of getting rid of the behavior. Okay, so what are some reinforcers of behaviors that you might punish? So again, I think it's, if you can, shut down, turn off the video and write down, okay, what are the behaviors that you're trying to punish? What are some of the ways that those are being reinforced? And so what might you do to get rid of these reinforcers and add punishers so you can actually reduce these behaviors? Okay. All right, so I hope you stopped the video and that you gave some time into thinking about what am I reinforcing, or what's being reinforced by these behaviors that I'm doing, and what punishments can I introduce, and what reinforcements will I need to eliminate in order to really effectively eliminate this behavior. So let's talk about alternative sources of reinforcement. So the effectiveness is going to depend on the availability of alternative ways of obtaining that reinforcement. So I told you about the example of when I'm eating ice cream, I love the feel of the coldness in my mouth and the coldness kind of going down my throat, and the memories of how fun it was to be with my mother and my grandmother, or being at Cape Cod on vacation with all of my family. There's like about 50 of us go every year. And I have all these memories from being a really young kid there. And now being an adult there with my kids and eating ice cream there. Well, what's another way that doesn't involve eating ice cream where I can get the nice taste of something cold going down my throat, and that would bring up memories of fun things to do? And maybe I want to use ice. So maybe I'm going to put ice into my mouth, maybe do shaved ice, put ice into my mouth, and as I'm eating the ice, reminisce about the fun memories of eating ice cream with my family. I don't have to be eating ice cream to reminisce about those fun things. So it would be reinforcing for me to be having that. This is another way that I can get that same reinforcement, the coldness going down and having those same thoughts while I'm eating ice instead of ice cream. Does that make sense? So if you can come up with other ways that you can get reinforced other than by that behavior, that's going to really help. So if you notice that your child is misbehaving, maybe they're playing with their food at the table and you're trying to reprimand them for that, but when you reprimand them, they're getting attention from the reprimand. So is there a way that they can get attention in other ways? So now maybe instead of giving them attention through reprimanding them when they're playing with their food, maybe when they're eating properly, you go, look, it's Sally at the table. Look what a good job you're doing eating your food properly. Look at the napkin in your lap and the way that you're holding your glass with two hands so it won't spill. And you're really giving them the attention, a way of earning attention that doesn't involve playing with food. So you're giving them an alternate source of reinforcement, an alternate way to get that reinforcement. Okay. What are some alternate sources of reinforcement related to the behaviors that you're trying to stop or decrease? Really, you can stop the video, look at what you wrote before. What could you do for alternative sources of reinforcement? And after you've thought that through, you can turn the video back on. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about in this video is the motivating operations. So just like with reinforcement, remember how we said food is going to be a better reinforcer if you're really hungry than if you just ate a whole bunch. Well, it's similar to punishers. So the effectiveness of a punisher can be increased by establishing operation. So if you're going to take food away, like you're going to make your son go to bed without dinner because they did something wrong, that's going to be much more effective if they hadn't been snacking all afternoon and they're actually hungry. So having to skip dinner when you're already hungry is going to be much more effective than if you took away dinner, but they've snacked all afternoon and they're not hungry at all. If you're going to take away their cell phone, but they've been on their cell phone most of the day and their eyes are getting blind from it, then that's not going to be as effective as if they have not been on their cell phone all day and now it's getting taken away. Social isolation, if they just stayed out with their friends past curfew and you go, well, now you can't see your friends tomorrow at all. Well, they just spent all night with them. They may not even want to be with their friends tomorrow. So social isolation will be a more effective punisher if the person already is deprived from being with people. So this is the same way that food is a better reinforcer when you're hungry. Things that we're going to take away now are going to be better if they're already slightly deprived from them. If they've already had their fill, then they're not going to be very punishing to not have them. They don't really want them anymore anyway. So we have now covered the introduction to punishment, the types of punishment, positive and negative, and then the variables affecting punishment. In this next video, I'm going to talk about the theories of punishment, problems with punishment, and alternatives to punishment. As always, if you have any questions, please email me at maryd@cameron.edu or marydz@cameron.edu. Either one will work.